The gym smelled like iron and old rubber, like sweat baked into the floor mats over 1,000 early mornings, like effort that never got acknowledged. It was 500 hours when she arrived. The base fitness center was empty at that hour, the fluorescent lights still flickering in the far corner where nobody had bothered to replace the bulb. The heating system groaned against the winter air pressing in from outside. Fort Delvray sat at the edge of a flat, gray plain, and in January, the wind came off that plain like something personal. Like it was trying to get in. Chief Petty Officer Mara Austin dropped her bag by the squat rack, unzipped it slowly, and began wrapping her hands. She moved with the kind of deliberate stillness that comes not from calm, but from practice. From years of learning how to hold yourself when the pain is something you've decided to ignore. Her right side was taped already, medical tape running from just below her armpit down to the ridge of her hip. Wrapped tight and precise the way she'd learned to do it herself, because she'd stopped going to the base medics 3 weeks ago. The official diagnosis had been 2 cracked ribs. The unofficial decision she had made was that the evaluation board was in 14 days and she was not stopping. Not for this. Not for anything. She loaded the bar with 60% of her usual weight. She knew the exact math of what her body could manage right now without causing structural damage that couldn't be hidden. She'd done the research. She'd read the medical literature at 200 on a Tuesday with a cold cup of coffee and a quiet kind of rage. And then she'd made her plan, because that was what Mara Austin did. She planned, she calculated, and then she worked. The first rep pulled a sound from somewhere deep in her chest, not a grunt, not a groan. Just a breath sharp and bitten back, like she'd learned to swallow the noise the way some people swallow pride. She racked the bar, steadied herself, and went again. Outside, the January wind pushed against the corrugated walls of the gym. The lights buzzed. Somewhere at the far end of the building, a door to the equipment room swung gently on its hinge, clicking in a slow, irregular rhythm. She was alone. She preferred it that way. Mara had been stationed at Delvray for 11 months. She had arrived from a deployment that nobody talked about openly, a maritime security operation off the coast of a country whose name appeared in briefings with a red tab. She had come back with a commendation, a sealed file, and a right side that had been reconstructed twice. The commendation sat in a drawer. The file sat somewhere above her clearance level. The ribs had never fully healed before she'd asked to be reassigned to the evaluation pipeline. Her request had been approved because her record was extraordinary and because the Navy sometimes mistakes endurance for recovery. She did not correct that mistake. She filed it away as useful. The thing people misunderstood about Mara Austin was this: she was not trying to prove something to the Navy. She was not trying to prove something to the men who had doubted her, or the system that had moved slowly around her ambitions, or the superior officers who had looked at her service record with mild surprise, as if excellence in a woman required an explanation. She was trying to prove something to a memory. Specifically, the memory of a man standing at the edge of a hospital bed in a naval medical facility 7 years ago, looking at the ruin the mission had made of her side, and telling her, quietly, carefully, without cruelty, that perhaps she should consider a different path. A desk position, something administrative, something that matched the current state of her body rather than the ambitions of her younger self. He had not said it to wound her. She understood that now, in the way you understand things that took years to stop hurting. But she had looked at him, at the silver on his collar, at the quiet authority in his posture, and made a decision inside herself that left no room for negotiation. She was going to become what he thought she couldn't. And so the bar went down again, and the air came through her nose in a controlled line, and the pain in her side bloomed like a slow fire. And she breathed through it the way you breathe through weather. You don't stop walking because it rains. She was halfway through her third set when she heard the side door open. She didn't look up immediately. People wandered in early sometimes. Other candidates in the pipeline, insomniacs, men who trained at odd hours because their personal lives had made irregular rhythms of them. She kept her eyes forward and focused on the mirror, watching her own form, monitoring the subtle signs of compensatory movement that meant she was favoring the injury in ways that would be visible to a trained eye. The footsteps that crossed the rubber floor were unhurried, measured, the kind of walk that doesn't announce itself but somehow fills the room. She racked the bar after her fifth rep and finally looked. He was in civilian clothes, dark trousers, a heavy navy wool pullover, no rank visible. He looked to be somewhere in his mid-60s, though the way he held himself compressed time. He had the posture of a man who had never once slumped in his life, who had sat upright at mess tables and briefing chairs, and in helicopters with their doors open over dark water, and had simply never stopped. His hair was silver white, cut short. His face was the kind of face that doesn't give things away. Deep-set eyes, dark brown, that moved across the gym with a systematic quality, taking inventory. He carried a small paper cup of coffee, and that detail alone, the ordinary, quiet humanity of it, made him more intimidating, not less. He glanced at her. She gave him a short nod, the standard acknowledgement between early morning gym occupants who are both there to work, not talk. He returned it. Then he set his coffee on the edge of a bench near the rowing machines and began his own warm-up. She watched him, not obviously, but in fragments, caught in the mirror between her own sets. He moved well, better than well. He moved like a man who had trained seriously for decades and whose body had learned to carry itself efficiently. He favored nothing. His range of motion was measured and controlled. He was not here to be seen. He was just here to work the same as her. She went back to her bar, 4 more sets. Then she would move to the functional movement section, the hanging exercises, the carries, the things that tested the body laterally, that revealed imbalances that straight-line lifting could hide. These were the movements that terrified her most right now, because the hanging work especially put lateral tension across the rib cage that was difficult to manage. And she had not yet solved the problem of how to do it without her face showing what it cost her. She would need to solve it today. She moved to the pull-up bar, gripped it, felt the immediate pull across her right side as her weight transferred into her arms and the rib cage expanded under the load. She pulled. The pain was specific and bright, like a drawn line of heat. She controlled it, reached the top, lowered, again. She was on her 4th repetition when she became aware that the older man had stopped moving, not stopped working out, stopped. Just standing, watching, not with the leering quality of men who watched women train because they confused gyms with entertainment. Something quieter, something more clinical. The look of someone who recognized something. She dropped from the bar after her 6th rep, turned, faced him directly the way she had learned to face things, straight on, without the soft angles of someone hoping not to be seen. He wasn't embarrassed to have been caught looking. He didn't apologize or pretend he'd been looking at something else. He simply said, "Your compensatory movement on the left. You're losing half an inch of lateral drive on every pull." She looked at him without expression. "I know." He picked up his coffee. "How long?" 3 weeks. He nodded once slowly, took a sip. Then, as if he'd decided the conversation was finished, he walked back to the rowing machine and sat down and began rowing with that same quiet, measured precision. She stared at the pull-up bar for a moment. Then she walked to the water fountain, drank, and began her carry work. They trained in parallel for the next 40 minutes without speaking. The gym filled with the sounds of machinery and breathing, and the particular silence of 2 people who are each deeply inside themselves, working on something private and important. The January wind continued outside. The broken light continued to flicker. The equipment room door continued its slow, irregular click. At some point, she noticed him rubbing the left side of his neck in a way that suggested an old injury. She said nothing. He had said nothing about her ribs beyond the one observation. They had reached a wordless agreement, the way people who understand physical pain sometimes do, that bodies carry histories, and you don't interrogate another person's history without invitation. She was cooling down, doing slow thoracic rotations on a mat, when she heard him walk toward her side of the gym to return a piece of equipment to its rack. He paused, not intrusively. Just long enough to ask, "Evaluation board, 14 days. Cracked," she looked up at him, too. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I had one fully broken once, during SEER training in '89. I finished the exercise." There was no boasting in the delivery. It was stated the way a geologist might describe a rock layer, as information, as evidence of what the earth is made of. She stood slowly, pressing her left hand against her side in the way she'd learned didn't reveal which side was injured to a casual observer, because it looked like the kind of stretch anyone might do. She watched him as she did it. "You're not a candidate," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, you're not stationed here." "No." "Then why are you in this gym at 500 in January?" He looked at her with those dark, unhurried eyes. "Because good gyms don't have audiences. And I'm visiting the base on a private matter." She absorbed this. There was something about him that sat at the edge of recognition, not the specific memory of a face, but the outline of a type. She had met men like this. Not often, but she had met them in certain rooms at certain hours, and they had always carried that same compression of time in their posture. The sense that they had been many places that required them to be very still and very certain. She went back to her mat and began the second portion of her cool-down. He collected his things. At the door, he stopped. "The lateral compensation will be visible in your running assessment," he said. "You need to tape differently. High anchor point above the fourth rib, not the fifth. The mechanical advantage is better, and the evaluator won't see the tape line under a fitted shirt." She stared at him. He nodded once, and left. She sat with that for a long time. 3 days later, she saw him again. This time it was 6:15, and the gym had 2 other candidates in it. He came in the same way, paper coffee cup, no announcement, civilian clothes that gave nothing away. He found a corner of the gym and began working. She was already deep into her session. They didn't speak until the other candidates left. He came to fill his water bottle at the fountain near her mat. She was sitting with her back against the wall, her shirt pulled up slightly on the right side, where she was retaping the anchor point the way he had described. The tape was halfway applied, her hand pressed flat against the ridge of the fourth rib, working slowly. He didn't look away, not out of impropriety. Out of the same clinical quality she'd seen 3 days ago. He looked the way surgeons look at injuries, with a seriousness that has no room in it for the discomfort of either party. He set his water bottle on the floor and crouched down with the ease of someone whose knees had been preserved carefully. "May I?" he said, not a question exactly. More like the announcement of an intention held respectfully in question form. She looked at him for a moment. Then she handed him the tape. He worked quickly and with extreme precision. The anchor point was exactly where he had described. He ran the secondary support band at a 40-degree angle across the lower margin of the injury, which she had not thought to do, and which immediately reduced the mechanical friction when she breathed. She breathed, her eyes widened slightly. "That's," she stopped, "reduces the shear load on the intercostal," he said simply. He stood, handed her back the roll of tape, and retrieved his water bottle. She pulled her shirt down. She was looking at him with the full attention she'd been rationing in fragments for 3 days now. "Who are you?" she asked. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, not hesitation. more like the brief consideration of a man who is deciding how much of himself is relevant to this conversation. "My name is Richard Cade," he said. The name didn't register immediately. It sat in her mind the way a word sometimes sits before meaning arrives, familiar in shape, slightly foreign in context. And then it arrived. Richard Cade. Vice Admiral Richard Cade. The name from the sealed briefing document she had never been supposed to see, but had glimpsed in a corridor handoff during the maritime security operation. The name attached to the operational authorization for the mission that had broken 2 of her ribs and left her in a naval medical facility, and placed a silver-collared man at the edge of her hospital bed. Not this man, a different admiral, but the name Richard Cade was attached to the oversight committee that had reviewed the operation afterward, that had reviewed what happened to her. She looked at him. He was watching her face with the careful attention of someone who has just said something they knew would matter. "You reviewed the operation," she said quietly. "The Maritime Security Operation, 2018. I was the senior oversight officer for the committee," he said. "Yes." The gym was very quiet. The broken light had finally been replaced by maintenance 2 days ago, and the room was fully lit now, and she wished suddenly that it wasn't, that there was some shadow to process this inside. "Then you read the report," she said. "I wrote the addendum," he said, "the one recommending commendation." She felt her jaw tighten. She felt the tape on her ribs as if for the first time. She felt all the mornings, all the 500 hours, all the sets she had loaded at 60%, all the bitten-back sounds. "You also," she said, and her voice was perfectly level, "had access to the full medical file." "Yes." "Then you know what they told me, in that hospital. About a desk position." He was quiet for a moment, a long moment, the kind that has weight. "I know," he said. "I read the conversation summary in the debrief. I disagreed with the recommendation." She looked at him. "I submitted a counternote," he said. "It was not binding, it was not enough. I have thought about that more than once." She stood up slowly from the mat. She was at full height now, and she was not a small woman. She had the frame of someone built for endurance and functional strength. And she had the posture of someone who had decided never to take up less space than she deserved. She lifted the hem of her shirt on the right side, deliberately, fully. The tape was visible, but beneath it and around it, visible along the curve of her ribs and down toward her hip, was the topography of a body that had been through what no report could fully quantify. The surgical scars, 2 of them, one older and faded to silver, one more recent and still pink, ran along the natural lines of the rib cage in the way that surgical scars do when they are done well. Which is to say, they were almost hidden, and somehow more devastating for it. The older scar was 7 years old, from the first reconstruction. The newer one was from the second, done 18 months ago when the inadequate healing from the first had finally required correction. She held his gaze while she let him see. He did not look away. He did not flinch or perform an emotion. His face did something more complicated than either of those things. Something moved through it, not guilt exactly, though guilt was in there. More like the arrival of the full weight of something he had only previously known at the abstract level of paperwork. The silence lasted a long time. Then he said very quietly, "You came back." "I never left," she said. He looked at the scars, then at her face. There was something in his expression that did not belong to the posture of admirals or oversight committees or men who wrote addendums in the night. It was older than all of that. It was the look of someone who has spent a long time holding a specific regret and has just been given the full dimensions of it. "The evaluation board," he said. "In 14 days. I will pass it," she said, not as a challenge, as a statement of geological fact. He nodded slowly. "I know you will." She lowered her shirt. She sat back down on the mat. She picked up her towel and pressed it to the back of her neck, and the gesture was so ordinary, so part of the rhythm of a training morning, that it somehow made everything that had just happened more real rather than less. He stood there for another moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup, empty now, long since cold, and held it like a man who'd forgotten he was holding it. "The taping method," he said. "A physical therapist taught me, after the broken rib in '89. Her name was Clara Marsh. I've used it every time since." I thought. He stopped, considered. "I thought it might be useful to pass on." She looked at him. "It was," she said. He nodded again. And then he walked to the door, and she watched him go. And the door opened, and the January air came in for just a moment, cold and flat, and carrying the smell of the plane outside, before the door swung shut again, and the gym returned to its warm, buzzing quiet. She sat there for a long time. The lights were all working now. The room was fully lit. She could see herself in the mirror, sitting against the wall, tape along her ribs, the particular stillness of someone processing something too large to be resolved quickly. She looked at herself the way you look at someone you've been traveling with for a long time and are only now seeing clearly. 7 years, 2 surgeries, every morning at 500. 60% of the weight, all the bitten back sounds, and a man crouching on the floor of a gym in January to teach her a taping method like it was the smallest and most obvious thing he could do. Like it was the beginning of an accounting too long overdue. She breathed in through her nose slowly, feeling the new tape hold in a way the old configuration hadn't. The pain was still there. Of course it was still there. Pain is not something you fix with better tape, but it was manageable. It was something she could work inside of. She stood up, loaded the bar to 65%. In 14 days, the board would sit. The evaluators would run their assessments. They would watch her carry, her run, her function under load. They would not see the tape beneath the fitted shirt. They would not see the scars beneath the tape. They would see a chief petty officer performing at a level that required explanation, until it didn't, until it was simply what it was, which was a woman who had calculated the exact amount of endurance required, and had arrived at that number years ago, and had been working toward it every morning since. The bar was cold in her hands. The gym smelled like iron and old rubber. Outside, January pressed against the walls. She breathed in, positioned herself, and lifted. Some things do not announce themselves. Some reckonings happen in ordinary rooms at ordinary hours, between two people who never expected to find each other there. And sometimes the most profound form of acknowledgement is not a ceremony or a commendation or a formal revision of a report written years ago, in the quiet of an oversight office. Sometimes it is a man crouching down and pressing tape against the architecture of your survival, and knowing, without being told, because the evidence is written into you in lines of silver and pink, exactly what it cost you to still be standing in that gym at 500 in January, loading the bar again. She held the weight, she found her breath, she pressed up through the dark.